Hey everyone, welcome to today's webinar, How Personal Data and Consumer Insights Should Be Used for Activation. My name is Ashley Brown. I'm a member of our Product Solutions team here at Simmons, and I will be moderating today's session. Just before we get started, there are a few logistics that I'd like to go over. First of all, we have placed everyone in listen-only mode. So if you have any questions or any comments, please make sure that you send those via the questions feature and the GoToWebinar panel. We are going to be addressing all questions at the end of the presentation. Also, just a reminder that we will be sending all attendees a copy of today's presentation and a recording of the webinar within the next few business days, and that recording will be available on our website as well. Today, our speaker is going to be Jonathan Greenwood, Senior Manager of Partnerships here at Simmons Research. At this point, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to John.
Thanks, Ashley. Good afternoon or good morning to those of you on the West Coast. As Ashley mentioned, my name's Jonathan Greenwood. I'm Senior Manager here on the Partnerships team. And I will be the one taking everyone through here our webinar around how personal data and consumer insights should be used for activation. So really quickly, just wanted to start you guys off in terms of why we chose this topic. What was the reason why this was what we wanted to bring to the forefront to everyone for everyone today. And really, the key thing is, we've seen over the last, whether it's the last couple months, last year or two, that there's been a lot of data privacy and kind of personal data news articles, events that have come to the forefront. Things like the Facebook Cambridge Analytica issue, as well as looking back to Equifax and the data breach there. Really seeing a lot of these types of situations occurring more frequently. And because of this, we're seeing obviously a groundswell in terms of folks wondering how their personal data is being used, who has access to it, and that's become something that folks are at least paying a little bit more attention to. And it's not only consumers that are concerned about it. Obviously, brands, agencies, there's a concern there as well. When we talk about potential new laws and things coming down the pipe, obviously, I'm sure many are aware that, with GDPR rolling out in the EU, that basically making the acquisition of data, your personal data, more transparent, giving consumers the ability to understand what is being tracked, what is my data being used for, and then putting also some guardrails around, what companies can use first-party data for. And one of the things that we're seeing a lot of is it's not only just data leakages, but it is sort of that transparency, right? With Facebook and Cambridge Analytica, it wasn't necessarily that consumers didn't agree to have this data pulled. It was more of they just didn't understand that this was what it was going to be used for. So that is something that from our perspective, as a market research company, that we need to be aware of and understand that we need to be providing privacy compliant data on a go-forward basis. So sort of along those lines, if we look at some sort of just kind of high-level data points, right? We want to get a sense for sort of how the consumer is seeing, all of these, whether it's data breaches, these lack of transparency, and really there's sort of a growing concern here from consumers around how companies, whether it's walled gardens or otherwise. And when I talk about walled gardens, what I'm talking about here is not necessarily the Twitters, the Amazons, the Googles of the world. Really talking about any sort of media owner that has first-party data. And what we're seeing, this is coming from Simmons NHCS survey, is that only roughly about a third, about 32% of the US population feels like they have any sort of control over their personal information online. And that's something, obviously, 2/3 of the country has basically said, I feel like I don't have any sort of understanding of how my data is being used, where it's going. And that's obviously something why the GDPR regulations were put into place in EU potentially could be something that comes down the pipe in the US as well. But what's sort of funny is that while only a third of the US population feels like they have control, only a quarter of the US population is actively reading privacy statements. So when they sign up for a mobile app, agreeing to the terms and conditions, the privacy statements, or whether they're going online, signing up on a website, no one's actively reading those terms and conditions. So one of the things to think about, right, is you know, is a consumer, when they accept those terms and conditions or those privacy, the sort of legalese around privacy, you know, is that appropriate consent? You know, folks, you know, when you're downloading an app and you're going through the, you know, opening up the, you know, creating an account in the app and you're agreeing to all this information, you know, is the utility that they're receiving from this app, you know, does that equate to the marginal utility that the app owner is getting from you know, collecting personal data? And that's where there's some potential issues there, right? You know, consumers aren't necessarily sure what's being collected, and even though there's, you know, these huge terms and conditions and privacy statements, you know, that's really not digestible for consumers. You know, a lot of times you're pulling up an app really quickly, you just want to get something done really fast, and you just agree to it. So, you know, having to go through a long list of T's and C's and privacy statements to get to what you're looking for, you know, ultimately it may not be, you know, really appropriate consent, just because, you know, it's just not the way people are thinking about, you know, what this app is going to be used for. And sort of along those lines, in terms of the overall control of personal information, so it's sort of similar to that, you know, we're only seeing 32% feel like they understand where their data is going, kind of being proliferated across the digital ecosystem. Only 63% would like, or 62.3% would like to have more control over their personal data. You know, they want to have greater transparency. And again, this is something, you know, coming out of these, you know, these data breaches, these, you know, the lack of transparency from, you know, whether it's Facebook or other companies, you know, wanting to be able to have greater transparency here. And that's sort of you know, something that I think is going to be more prevalent in the coming months, years, as folks become more aware of, you know, how their data is being used. And that's, you know, could be a potential concern for, you know, our market research type companies, brands, agencies around, you know, if you're using first party data or, you know, any sort of personal data for activation purposes, that, you know, that there is transparency, there is consent, and that, you know, consumers will feel comfortable with the use of their data. And then one of the things that we're seeing, you know, and I would say this is over the last, you know, few months, even the last year or two, is that not only, you know, when we talk about walled gardens, again, I'm talking about media owners with any sort of first party data, that there isn't greater transparency between, you know, say a brand or agency and the walled garden. What we're really seeing is that the walls are getting higher and thicker, and there's less data coming in, there's less data going out. You know, the transparency really just isn't there. And, you know, for a brand or agency, when you're working with these walled gardens around, you know, activation purposes, you know, really trying to understand, you know, what, you know, the segmentation schemes that they may be using that you can use to target individuals. You know, is this data that you really would want to be working with? Is it sort of privacy compliant? And that's something to, you know, to take into consideration, especially moving forward as consumers are becoming more aware around how their data is being used. So, you know, we wanted to touch on some potential pitfalls that brand or agencies, you know, might run into when working with these media owners or walled gardens. So these are some of the questions that we've, you know, sort of been throwing around, you know, as we see it in terms of potential hurdles or things that, you know, could really be an issue, at least as a current state today. So right now, do these walled gardens, do they have the proper permissions in place to actively collect this personal data? Do they have appropriate consent from the consumers and individuals? You know, and do these individuals not only they provided consent, but even, you know, say they say yes, do they have the ability later on to say, you know what, I actually don't want to be, you know, have this data collected, and do they have the ability ultimately to opt out? And then any of the data that they're collecting, you know, that they're processing, they're ultimately storing, you know, what are they doing to prevent these, you know, data leakages? So you don't run into something like an Equifax, where, you know, basically everyone in their universe, all of their personal data has been, scavenged and could be used for nefarious purposes. These are some key questions that, as a brand or agency, you probably want to confirm. And then ultimately, the next question is the data that they're collecting. How easy is it to judge the quality of it? Is it something that truly is a differentiator, a thing that will allow a brand or agency to effectively target individuals with advertising? And in certain cases, it's very difficult to determine, one, the questions and these pitfalls that I just outlined, but then also how easy is it in terms of getting transparency from these walled gardens back to the brand or agency. So we talked about sort of the future, or the current hurdles and pitfalls there on the last slide. There's also some future questions to consider. So obviously, with the issue that Facebook had with Cambridge Analytica, they've ultimately shut off access for companies like Acxiom, Experian to push data, whether it's clients or their own data, into the Facebook platform. Are other walled gardens like Facebook, would they, will there be others that ultimately follow their lead? Because sort of what Facebook did was they took this Cambridge Analytica sort of issue that they had and sort of flipped it on its head and said, hey, actually, you know what, we're going to do some things to protect privacy, where how we view it is essentially these were things that they probably have been wanting to do for a long time. Shut off access for Acxiom or Experian, not allow any sort of third-party verification. Say, hey, we're going to keep all of this in-house to prevent any sort of leakages, or so our PII or the personal data that we're collecting on our users isn't going anywhere. It's staying within our ecosystem, and ultimately that sort of serves their purpose. But in reality, I don't think it necessarily provides transparency for the market as a whole. And ultimately, this brings up some other questions, right? So now that they're keeping all this data in-house, would brands, if brands have some first-party data at their fingertips, would they be comfortable with providing that first-party data to these walled gardens without using an Acxiom or Experian, a safe haven where they could make sure that their data is being located in a secure area? Sort of giving up the keys to the castle there, saying, hey, take our first party data and we'll try to leverage it within the Facebook universe or within Google's universe or what have you. So that's another question that, down the road, is that going to be more prevalent, and how are brands going to deal with that? And then lastly, I mentioned this a second ago, but there's also really a lack of transparency in terms of third party verification for, if you're using, data from these walled gardens. Hey, if you're going to go into Facebook or into Google, they have their own segmentation schemes around how you can target folks, and ultimately they're going to be providing verification back around how well they did. And we sort of see this as sort of grading your own homework. There isn't necessarily an incentive to, or there's at least a opportunity for abuse, from the walled garden side, and not being transparent around really what's going on. And that's, obviously that's something that will continue to be an issue. Isn't necessarily that there's a solution for right away, but it is something, again, as the walled gardens, the walls are getting higher, less transparency, it becomes a big issue, not being able to understand how well you are performing within these walled gardens. So ultimately, right, there's a lot of issues, with sort of not having privacy compliant data, having some of these walled gardens start to, cut off access to, for, brands or agencies to understand, the performance or who they're reaching within these platforms. Really, where can you turn? What can you do to, really start to kind of bring some of that information back, to the brand or to the agency to understand your performance and how well you're doing. And we really feel that there is an opportunity to leverage sort of deep consumer insights and segmentation schemes for activation, utilizing, brands like Simmons, where you can bring in, your first party data, combine it with Simmons data, which, we'll talk through some of the benefits there. in the coming slides. So, really to get a 360-degree view of your consumer, ultimately for activation or for analytical purposes within a DMP, and distribute this data really anywhere you'd like to. So, talking about privacy compliant data. So you mentioned this earlier, but within some of the pitfalls that you run into with working with these media owners that have first party data, a number of the things that we outline there in terms of Simmons data or any sort of other like market research companies, really the great things that we bring to the table is that in order to be sort of privacy compliant, is that we have consent from our respondents, right? There's transparency between us and the folks that we're surveying. They know, hey, I'm working with Simmons. They're the ones that are collecting data on me. I know that they want to collect data on me, and they're gonna, this is what they're in business to do. Not, hey, I'm downloading an app. I want it because it provides some utility for me. And oh, by the way, I have to accept these terms and conditions. And then ultimately, they are pulling in data, which I don't know what they're pulling in. I don't know how it's being used or where it's going. This is something that we can at least bring to the table. The other thing is that we know who our respondents are. They know who we are. There isn't a any sort of middleman in the middle of this where it's obscuring who's ultimately using the data downstream. We also provide clear opt-out instructions, and there's a direct line of communication. So at any point they might have agreed, hey, yeah, I'd like to be part of the Simmons survey, and later on they decide, you know what, this isn't for me, don't want to do that. They have a clear way to opt out of this. And then lastly, which is obviously a big thing, respondents are provided compensation for their data. So, they're provided a fair compensation. So they know, me taking this survey, what Simmons is compensating me for, I feel is accurate and makes sense to me, that I'm happy to move forward and provide this level of data to Simmons. So there's a lot of different things that it's harder to confirm from the walled garden or the media owner's side, that at least with the survey respondents that we get here at Simmons, you can confirm a lot of those pitfalls. So we talked about how Simmons data or survey research data can be effective in having instead of having data where you're unsure where it's coming from that may not be privacy compliant, and this type of Simmons survey research data obviously is much more privacy compliant. How does Simmons data sort of fit into the overall kind of digital ecosystem? How can you leverage this type of data across the ecosystem? So this is sort of a busy slide, and I'll go from right to left here and walk you through sort of how this all fits in, how the data flows, where it ultimately ends up. And there's sort of two key paths that I'll walk through. So starting off sort of on the bottom right-hand corner, you'll take our Simmons data, push that into a safe haven or non-border type company where our respondent level data is essentially projected out to the total US population. And then from there, if we move down on the bottom portion of that flow here into the data marketplaces, we have some sort of standard segments that we've created that are out available for consumers to leverage, or brands or agencies to leverage. So these are sort of some canned standard segments that we feel are some of the most asked about questions or segmentation schemes that we have found with our clients. And that they're available, they're out there live now, whether it's the LiveRamp data store or Acxiom's Audience Cloud, they're there for you to take a look at and potentially leverage there. But then there's also a secondary way that Simmons data can be leveraged here through this flow. So again, going through a safe haven or onboarder, we can also tie our data to first party data. So any sort of CRM file or just really any first party data that a client or an agency might have can be brought in and essentially fused together. And then from there, it can be pushed into a DMP, a DSP for analytical purposes, for activation activities, etc. And this really provides some sort of key benefits, right? So there's you have on-demand calibration where you can do this, create these segmentations on the fly. You can adjust them as you see fit, as you work through a campaign, changing, modifying them to meet your needs. There's some other things around predictive psychographics, which I'll touch on later on here in the webinar. And then also media and e-com activation. As I'd mentioned, pushing it to a DSP, being able to activate on it is obviously a great benefit of this type of setup. And then also consumer research, right? So if you have the data in in a data management platform, being able to pull in other data sets to sit alongside the Simmons or your first-party data to do advanced analytics to really get that 360-degree view of the consumer. I think that this is a great way to do it, and it allows for your first-party data to sort of flow all the way through. There's no there's not a game of telephone going on where your first-party data is not necessarily making it all the way through to a DMP or a DSP. It's going to flow all the way through, which is really a strong benefit of this type of solution. So getting a little bit deeper into the activation component and sort of how you can leverage this privacy compliant market research data. So I talked about how it goes through. You take Simmons data, first party data, bring it into an onboarder, and in certain cases we'll use Axiom, in other cases we might use Experian. Essentially what happens is we take our respondent level data and we fuse it onto whether it's Axiom's info-based population, Experian's consumer view population, and then that can be pushed out to a DSP, so you can activate on the entire US population. There's also some other things we can do. You can also move into push this type of data into ratings companies like a Nielsen or a ComScore. So overlaying your first-party data along with any sort of Simmons segmentation schema you might be looking to leverage onto TV ratings or IRI and look at purchase behavior. So there's a number of different sort of endpoints where this data could end up. So you can activate on it. You can also do consumer research. So getting that holistic view again. So you got the viewer, the purchase behavior, all tied to privacy compliant data, from Simmons or any type of market research type company. So I mentioned this 2 slides ago in terms of predictive psychographics. I want to give a little bit more detail on sort of what that is, how it can be leveraged, and really sort of the benefits of it. So with predictive psychographics, what we can do is say you take someone who is a Pepsi drinker, and we look at all of their different attributes. So they have they're have certain attitudes about purchase. They're what they like to purchase in terms of CPG goods, or these are their financial behaviors, or these are the types of cars that they purchase, and we can align up those other attributes around their other brand preferences and what things that they like, and say we could model that up to Coke drinkers, and essentially we'd be able to determine those of the Pepsi drinkers that might their attitudes, their preferences are very similar to certain Coke drinkers, and in this way we can essentially model out those that could be good prospects. So with activation, like I was describing before, you're talking about people with a current state. They have these attitudes, they have these preferences, and that's how you go activate on them. In this this form of predictive psychographics, what you can do is essentially create these populations of prospects, of folks that potentially might be someone that will buy my product in the future. And what you can do here is not only provide them an ad unit at to the right person at the right time, but you can also craft the right message with this. You'd be able to understand this person, while they may not buy this product now, in the future they might be a good candidate for that. And thus you can tailor the message, so you can get into sort of the content creation with the predictive psychographics. That I think really becomes powerful in terms of, again, delivering that right message. And then obviously with the benefit of it being privacy compliant data. So tying that all in, which is really, I think, a kind of fantastic sort of addition to this entire ecosystem. So giving you an overview of sort of how Simmons data, the survey research data fits into the overall ecosystem here, what we want to do now is walk through some case studies. So give you a sense of how are our clients using this today to improve their business, really move forward, whether it's an agency working with their clients or a brand just understanding more about their customer base. So we'll walk through a couple of examples here to give you a sense of how this is worked previously. So we're going to go over two different case studies here. So we're going to talk about one that's a major agency as well as a music streaming service. Overall, they're going to function somewhat similar in terms of the overall flow of the first-party data, how it works. And I'll walk through the differences here in the coming slides. But basically, I've taken the part of the process flow that we outlined a couple slides ago as this is really the flow that we're going to be looking at over the next two examples. So we're going to be working with Simmons data, first-party data, working through a safe haven or an onboarder, that getting pushed into a data management platform and then ultimately used for activation either through walled garden media owners or any sort of demand side platform that the client ultimately wants to leverage. So the first case study we'll take a look at is a media agency. So this is a large agency with multiple subsidiaries. They've actually been working with Simmons for over 15 years, working on a custom study. So they had us do a smaller study outside of our standard NHCS survey, where they asked some very pointed questions for some very specific topics that they were interested in. And really, there were a couple key challenges. So they wanted to be able to leverage this small scale study to be able to deliver more people-based insights and ultimately activate from their data stack. So, bringing in all this other third-party data or other first-party data that they have at their fingertips, but also bring in this this custom survey that this proprietary survey that they've been working with us on for many years, and ultimately want to generate more relevant advertising experiences for consumers. So the solution that we developed, I talked a little bit about this earlier, but working with, in this case, Acxiom, we took the Simmons respondent level data, and then we fused that data to Acxiom's info-based population. And from there, what we did was we pushed that out to their data stack. And what the great thing that we found with doing this is that we had a really strong correlation between our pre-existing panel weighting factors and then the expansion output onto InfoBase. So we knew, coming out of this, that the way that we have fused our data onto the InfoBase population, there was a really high correlation, and we feel really comfortable about, hey, you know what, the data that our end client, this media agency, is going to get is going to be very representative of the types of segmentation schemes that they can build is going to be very representative of the U.S. population, and that allows them the ability to provide more relevant advertising as well as people-based insights within their data stack, which is fantastic. And what's great is once we did this with this agency, we were able to fold this into the next case study that I'll walk you through. So the next case study is this music streaming service. So this is a large music, podcast, video streaming service with more than 140 million monthly active users. And again, I'll preface this is this specific client, this music streaming service, they were working with the agency that we outlined in the last case study. But it sort of took a different direction. It's a little bit different flavor in terms of how this activation solution ultimately, the solution we ultimately designed. So the challenges here were this particular client, they had internal customer segmentation schemes. So they had, I think, 5 different customer segments that they had built internally. So, obviously a lot of it was based off of the listening behavior, what type of music, podcast, what videos are you watching, that type of data. They had, really rich data there. So, they can infer some things based off of that, that listening behavior, but ultimately they didn't have a really deep understanding of who their user base was. And they really wanted to understand beyond just their music interests, what makes them who they are. So they needed some additional deep profiling information, as well as some historical data on their segments. And they wanted to do two things. So they want to be able to conduct further analysis as well as activate on these segments. So the solution, somewhat similar to the agency's solution, but there's a little bit different. There's some additional steps in here. So what we did was we took their segmentation schemes and we brought them onto the Simmons respondent file. So we applied the same sort of, hey, this is who we're looking at, from the client saying, hey, this is who we look at. We applied that to our respondent level file. And then sort of similar process flow is what we saw with the agency, where we took that respondent level file, we pushed it through, again, Axiom in this case, had that extrapolated out onto the info-based population. But then two things happened. The agency that we talked about, they ultimately got a file with the Simmons variables as well as the custom segmentation scheme that the client had internally. And then the client, the music streaming company, ultimately got this data pushed over to Adobe Audience Manager, where they were allowed to, or were able to, do some additional analytics, understand their consumer better, and then from there, optimize their segmentations. And the sort of beauty behind this is that now they have, from their internal segmentation scheme, they are working with the same data as their agency is working with, and the agency can obviously push that to a DSP where they can make ad buys. And so what's fantastic is it's not a game of telephone. There's no point at which the segmentations that the client or the music streaming service is creating, there's no disconnect between them and their agency. They're working with the same data set, and ultimately that can be pushed to a DSP, and then ad buys are put against that. So there's a seamless process here. There's no issues where you get to a DSP or you get to a walled garden and you say, I'm looking for this particular segment. They don't have something that's necessarily exactly what you're looking for. In this case, all of the data can be pushed throughout the process, and there's no loss of fidelity there. And then sort of bringing this all sort of back home is that not only is this data proprietary to the client, it'll have been sourced through known channels. It'll be privacy compliant. And you can feel good about the data that is being pushed out there, that there's no issues in terms of how the data was collected. There's no issues around transparency of the data with the consumer who ultimately provided it. And that is something that if down the road, if there are sort of additional laws or things that come into place like GDPR, there isn't going to be any sort of degradation of what you're trying to do in terms of as a brand or agency in terms of targeting the audiences that you're looking for. And that's something that we think is particularly powerful. So that was sort of the core information that I was looking to cover off on today. Obviously, if you guys have questions, thoughts, comments, feel free to enter that into the chat feature there in the GoToWebinar. And with that, I will turn it back over to Ashley, who can moderate that.
Awesome. Thanks, Jonathan. That was great. Again, this is Ashley with Simmons. If you do have any questions, you feel free to send them through our questions feature right now, and we will get those addressed. We've had a few come through during the presentation, so we can go ahead and cover those for now. The first one is going to be, what type of canned segments are already available in the various data stores that we could take a look at?
Yeah, sure. So right now we have roughly 140 different segments that are available out currently in LiveRamp's data store, as well as the Axiom Audience Cloud. And they cover off on a number of sort of key areas. There's a focus on automotive, CPG, financial, healthcare. There's some political information, as well as, I believe, some retail information. And a lot of what you're going to find out there is going to be, attitude and behavior propensities, product propensities. What type of vehicle do you want to, are you looking at potentially purchasing in the next 6 months? things like that are really the focus there within those standard segments.
Okay, great. And then we also have segments built from Simmons data that we've used for years. How would we go about working with you on getting these set up for activation?
No, that's a really good question. So obviously the first step would be to get with your Simmons rep, and they can help facilitate this process. But basically what we would do is we take a look at the segments or the variables that you've been working with, and essentially determine feasibility there, to understand that you make sure that, yep, we're going to see solid coverage across the US, that you're going to get good results as we push this through to make it available for activation. So we provide feasibility there, and then ultimately it would be probably about a week or so once that's determined that the segments are feasible, from getting it from the segments within the Simmons responder file pushed out to whether it's a DMP or a DSP of choice. That it'd be about a week or so to get that out there, and then you'd have the ability to activate off of it.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, Jonathan. You gave a lot of great information today. If your question wasn't addressed, please know we will be reaching to you offline to make sure it is taken care of. We're going to go ahead and start wrapping things up. So again, I would like to thank Jonathan for a wonderful presentation and all of our attendees for their time and attention during the presentation. We will be sending out a recording and a copy of the presentation we went over today. It will be sent to you via email, and you can also access it on our website. Real quickly before we go, just want to remind everybody that we will be hosting another webinar next Thursday, June 28th, in the same time in the same place. It will be covering our retail trends and technology study, taking a little bit of a deeper look into the male shopper. So if you are interested in attending that, you can go ahead and register for that on our website. So again, thank you everyone, and I really hope you enjoy the rest of your day.